Hello, hello. This is Jessica Gerlach, certified personal trainer and author of the book You Don't Make Friends with Salad. And you're listening to the 5 Foot Strong podcast, the show that we will do a deep dive into our personal strengths, discover what makes you strong, and talk about our physical and mental health journeys. Whether you are 5 feet tall like myself or 5'11", we are all 5 foot strong in our own unique and beautiful ways. So please take a big deep breath in, get comfortable, and let's do this. Hello, hello, and welcome back to the 5 Foot Strong podcast. I am your host, Jessica Gerlach, and on today's episode, I have a very important and knowledgeable guest in the mental health space. He's a lawyer, a member of the Provincial Parliament of Ontario. He represents the riding of Vaughan-Woodbridge, and he is currently the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions right here in Ontario. This next guest and I share the very same goal to end the stigma around mental health, and I am so excited to talk with him today. So let's get into it all, and let's welcome the Honourable Minister Michael Tibollo to the 5 Foot Strong podcast. How are you today?
I am great, Jess. Thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to ask you the question that I ask all my guests is, what does the adjective of someone being strong mean to you?
Well, to me, someone who's strong is someone who's resilient, someone who understands the things that need to be done each and every day, looks after themselves from every aspect, physically, mentally, of course, it is extremely important, and basically goes about his or her business every day.
Makes sense to me. And so why did you want to stand up for mental health?
Well, that's an interesting question because my background is economics and political science, and then I became a lawyer. Never thought that psychology or sociology were courses that were of interest to me. And then, how wrong I was, because really a lot of times the work that you do in law has a psychological aspect to it. But when I started working in a residential therapeutic community to help men with addictions, I started realizing how important mental health is and how it impacts people and sometimes, leads them down a path that takes them to an addiction. And so, being from an Italian background as well, my dad would never, like if I wasn't feeling good one day, just even suggest that I was depressed or that I had, anxiety. It says, come on, suck it up, let's go. There was never that opportunity to look at those things and the impact. Luckily for me, they were never significant issues, but there's a lot of people that are not as lucky, and they're in the same situation where they don't seek out that help, or they don't get it because of the stigma associated with it, especially in different cultures that all live here in the province of Ontario.
Why do you think there is such a stigma around mental health?
Well, that's again a really interesting question, because I always liken it to breaking a bone or cutting your arm and needing to get stitches or get your legs set with a cast. We seem to recognize illnesses or injuries that are physical because we see them. But I think a lot of times, because we don't see the damage or the potential damage, I think what happens is people think that it's not as relevant. And then depending on where you come from in the world, psychology was invented or was developed in the United States, Canada, and England, very individualistic societies where you focus more on you than you do on community. Then you have collectivist organizations or collectivist societies that are not focused on the individual, but rather on the well-being of the community. So that would be the South Asian, the Jewish, the Italian, the Black community, Indigenous. I mean, it goes on and on. There are more collectivist societies than there are individualistic. So when you try to analyze a problem from an individualistic approach or angle, you start getting the tensions between the culture and the therapy or what you're trying to accomplish. which is one of the reasons why in a lot of the work I do, I look for culturally sensitive, culturally appropriate supports and services. It's building that therapeutic alliance, that sense of trust. That happens within a community when you talk openly about it. So the stigma's there, but I really believe that the work that we're doing and the fact that so many more people are being trained from these different cultures that are able to step up and provide supports and services to their communities, I think that's going to make a huge difference in people's lives.
Well, we have just talked about my personal past, and I had depression clinically. I was diagnosed as being clinically depressed when I was in my teens, and I think the number one thing that was the hardest thing, but I now look back as a sign of strength, was accepting that I needed to get some help and accepting that I needed support because I couldn't do it alone. Do you agree
Yeah.
with that?
Again, that's a cultural thing, right? Because if you were from an individualistic society,
Yeah.
you'd be pushing for help. I mean, I'll be honest with you, my kids have said to me, Dad, we want to see someone, and I've encouraged them to go. I think as time progresses, my kids were born here, they're second generation. They see the world very differently than I saw it, with a dad who came over here from Italy with nothing and basically said, get to work and like suck it up. And I would never say that to my kids, because
Right.
I also appreciate the fact that there is that potential need. And of course, you can heal. That's the beautiful part about when someone is suffering from depression or anxiety or any of the other mental health issues that arise, especially in young people. All of these, there are therapies and even psychotropic medications that help stabilize individuals. So I'm a huge believer that all of us should speak to someone, and when we feel the need, really open up, and I encourage people to do that, my kids especially. But again, I think it comes from the fact that, depending on where you are when your parents came to this country, and we have a lot of new immigrants here that
Yeah.
come from a collectivist society, so they're in the exact same situation, maybe worse, because a lot of them are going through trauma that was induced by genocide in the country that they left, or religious persecution, or whatever the issue was that brought them to Canada for safety.
Do you find like newcomers are accepting, like that they understand about mental health awareness?
I know they don't, and it's not that they don't. It's because, again, they're coming from a collectivist worldview. What that means is that everything gets resolved within the family. When we have a problem, we talk about it inside our family. We do not go outside to talk to strangers. Matter of fact, we don't even talk to other family members. Just our nucleus family, just the closest of the close. And again, I went to an event about a year ago in the Ethiopian community, and I met the first Ethiopian psychiatrist in their community. He was there, and I thought, what an amazing, thing to have a psychiatrist that's from your culture, because that will encourage people to speak to him, because there's that therapeutic alliance that's built on trust, on language, on culture. It's very hard for someone who's not from that culture to be able to speak to them, especially if they don't understand some of the intergenerational trauma issues. It's easy to say, oh, the Holocaust and the implications it had on a person. If you haven't lived it, you don't know
Right.
what family experience was. And that goes for many other communities as well that have had the intergenerational trauma that continues. And, we see it now even more with what's happening in Israel and Hamas. These are things that I remember hearing a story one time of an old man who kept his car, gassed up and ready to go. And the son said to him one day, why do you keep the car gassed up? You can't see anymore. You can't drive. And he said, you never know when you're going to need the car to escape. And of course, he was Jewish.
Hmm.
And so I'm thinking to myself, how does a person who's gone through the Holocaust, who's lived, this was in the United States, who's lived in the United States for like 40 years, still have that mindset that I've got to be able to escape? That gets passed on to the kids,
Hmm.
and that, the individual. So you need someone who understands that intergenerational trauma to really have that conversation and to help that person that the anxiety that that person has, and it's real because, we're seeing it, right? We're seeing it
Yeah.
now again. So it is a real fear, and it affects people, but it affects them in a way that you don't see it visibly. It affects their minds.
Yeah, and that
So,
goes back to the mental health. Like, it's going to
yeah,
affect their mental health in the end, whether it be from the Holocaust or whether it be from this generation of what we see going on right now.
yeah,
And, I think that's, doing this podcast, I've realized that there is a generational and a gender difference between the people wanting to share mental health stories and being aware. And I've always shared my mental health story because I find that that helps me. I want to share with people what I went through so that hopefully, you know a teenager doesn't go through what I went through back when I was in high school. But
yeah.
I'm also noticing I'm asking a lot of men to share their stories, and they're stepping back a little bit. And so I do see that there still is that stigma there.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I deal with this every day, right? Like my work, it's interesting because my work, you'd think it'd all be legislative, being the minister, and that we'd be looking at different things that we do as a government. But the human element of the portfolio I have is sometimes overwhelming. I mean, I was on a call on Friday with a father who lost his daughter to suicide, and listening to the tragedy of the 25-year-old's last year before committing suicide, and the father, just how devastated, and how emotional he was in speaking to me. But that, I hear these all the time because they're everywhere. The stories relating to eating disorders, young people that have mental illness, that or have acute issues that are not being dealt with because they don't believe that they're sick, and trying to find resources to assist them. I mean, the problem we have is that historically we've really not had a system. We've had a whole bunch of silos, and that might add to the stigma as well, right? Because if you can't call one number and speak to somebody and navigate through a system, you got to repeat your story 15 times. And when you're in repeating it, I think sometimes people get a little embarrassed, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't get embarrassed. But that's part of the problem, and part of my responsibility is to build that continuum of care in the communities to provide those supports and services for individuals where and when they need them. And that's what I'm trying desperately to do, is to build those systems. And by building them, build resiliency in individuals, give them the tools they need to be able to say no to substances, and look to life as the answer as opposed to a substance. And of course, again, substances is a huge issue. It has absolutely nothing to do with like, I've never heard a person say, when I grow up I want to be an addict. Addiction is directly related to mental health issues where they're not resolved, and a person decides to try to self-medicate. And as a result of that self-medication, becomes addicted, and then is using the substance not to feel better, but he or she has to use a substance, because at that point the substance withdrawal is so hard on the body that it forces them to continue using, and there's your addiction.
Yeah, talking about addiction, when I was obese, I used to heal my emotions, I used food. And in some sense, I think food is one of the number one addictions there is because people are eating their feelings away, literally.
Yeah,
And people don't have to take drugs, but people have to eat every day. And
yeah,
so that causes a whole issue on its own.
yeah. That's 100% true. I mean, the addictions that we see, and food is an addiction, right? It's recognizing that it's an addiction and doing something about it. You did. And that again, we have ways of working to rewire our brain to be able to cope with complex situations. And once we learn how to cope them, I always say there's two spirals potentially: the spiral downwards, which goes very quickly when you have an issue and you don't resolve it, and the spiral just goes, it takes you down to the point where you can't function anymore, then the spiral upward. And the spiral upward is when you recognize that you have an issue, you seek the help, and then that help starts you on an upward spiral. And then you start getting back your sense of confidence, your sense of accomplishment. You start to feel better. You start to interrelate with other people. So you get away, because with an eating addiction, you also have that isolation, right? Because it kind of draws you away from everyone. You start getting into the social activities again. You start to become more engaged with family, with everyone else. That's really the purpose of putting together plans for individuals
And
when
that
it comes to looking
strength
after
is
their mental health.
accepting that you have an issue. Strength, inner strength is what that upper spiral is to get you dig
Yeah,
yourself out of that
yeah.
hole.
And
And
every day you get stronger, that spiral, right? It gets
yeah,
stronger, that feeling, that emotion, and you know what? Not to say that you're not going to have a little bit of a downturn, because we all do, right? Like
everybody does. Yeah.
life is not just it's not just an upward kind of like movement. There's always going to be that cyclical wave that's going to happen. But what happens is when you're on a high, like from life, and you start to experience a drop in your emotions, or you start to feel, you have the ability, understanding that you are able to have those highs on life, that you're going to go through that cycle, and that resiliency comes back, and you have another great day, and it just goes that way in a cycle. And for me, I look all the time at how we measure, people's success. I've come to the conclusion, and it's just maybe because you get to a certain spot on the mountain, you start to sort of see the other side, and you realize there are other things you need to consider in life. But the other than making money, and my greatest happiness comes in great conversations with people, especially young people, when they are inquisitive and want to learn. And I really enjoy those moments. And even with conversing with friends, and talking about issues that relate to things other than business, it really makes me feel accomplished to have those kind of conversations, because I know that it's a deeper conversation than just talking about business, or hey, how are you? I'm great, and just walk away. Understanding the needs of the other person that you're engaged with. The line that I always remember is Robin Williams, the line that, be kind to each other, because you don't know what that person you're meeting is going through. And so when you think about, encountering somebody for the first time, or hey, how's it going? And you just kind of like do it in a very kind of like, casual way, not really that person, you have no idea, or you get angry with someone, you have no idea what that person's going through. And so I think, you know, being more human with each other, um, that also adds to a person's mental wellness. Because again, we don't live in isolation. We live in community. We live in a community, in a world where we exchange ideas, we share each other's food, we speak to each other. Our kids go to school together. Our communities are all linked in so many different ways. And you also see it in marriages now. Like you've got all kinds of marriages cross-cultural. Like I remember when I was young, you never saw that. So the world is changing. It's becoming more homogeneous in a way. And we have to be human with each other. And if
Yeah.
we are, I think that will make a huge difference in overall in people's mental wellness. Because again, not everybody needs to see a shrink. Not everybody needs help with an addiction. The percentages that do need that help. But if we look after each other in community, a lot of people don't necessarily need to go see someone. They can get it from each other just by talking, by sharing, and by being around each other.
Yeah, that's what community is all about. But question, how do you prioritize your mental health?
Well, my mental health, I look after by um, getting away from my routines. I'm a very regimented person. I'm up at 4 every morning. I read for 2 hours till 6, shower, and I'm in my office by 7 a.m. at Queen's Park. and I have a full day, and I'll finish here sometimes 7, 8 o'clock at night, dinners, but it's all structured, and then I give myself my time. So Friday, I went to a place called Shawanaga, and I went fishing with First Nations. So I had got to spend time on the water, and it was a beautiful day. Tonight, I have hobbies, and tonight I'm working on my little pepper plants because I'll be planting my garden soon. I grow 124 different varieties of hot peppers.
Love
So
it.
I have all my little seedlings started. They're all about that tall. And tonight I've got to do some work on them because they need to be tended to because of I need them to grow a little bit quicker. So I've got to change the lighting on them and do a couple different things. So to me, it's that distraction, if you can call it a distraction, where I do something that's out of the norm of what I normally do. And so those are the kinds of things that I do. And then on the weekends, I'll usually catch up with a friend or two, not too many because it's just like the time is just it's so precious, and time with the family as well. I try to balance that part out. They'll tell you differently. It's probably why they all need to go see shrinks because I'm never there. But I come from a world where we had nothing as kids, and so you have to fight for everything. And I have a very strong kind of determination that I've got a strong work ethic that I've got to put in my time to make sure that the food is on the table. And my kids are very different. They say, "Well, Dad, we want you. It's not about the food." I say, "Yeah, it's easy to say that when you got the food on the table." But so there's that constant tugging, back
But
and
it just
forth
shows
to
that
balance it.
somebody as busy as you can prioritize their mental health. And you
You
know
have
what?
to.
And that's
Yeah.
what I wanted to, that's the strength, because some people just say, "Oh, I'm too busy with work. I can't do anything." That you bring happiness to your life. And I think you need to bring balance to your life.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, I practice mindfulness. I spend 20 minutes in meditation every day as well.
Yeah.
And I find that really important for me because it centers me.
Yeah.
As busy as my day is, I stop and I give myself that 10 minutes of breathing that's going to help me. And then I do it a second time, usually at night, to help me, kind of like calm down and put myself in a state where I can fall asleep and sleep. And I don't sleep a lot, but I do sleep well. And I think a lot of that has to do with taking the time to check in on myself, right? So that if I had a word of advice for anyone listening to us, check in on yourself, and if you have to, practice it with someone, because a lot of times we forget. But once you start building these patterns, so I have a very rigorous schedule from 4 till 8 every night, but built inside that schedule is 20 minutes for me. And if I can, the luxury or that sweet for me, that my dessert is to have that time on the weekends when I can, tend to the garden, when I can get my hands dirty, and like that really for me is for my mental wellness. I can buy all the peppers I needed, but it's not the point. The point is to grow them and to watch them grow. And it's interesting because the work that I do in addictions and the treatment center that I used to run, one of the things that came out in all of the individuals that were in the program was that the best time that they had was working in the gardens and looking after the animals, because it gave them a sense of who they were, where they were, and the interrelationship between man, vegetable, like plants, and animals. And that grounding, I think, is what makes a person realize that we're all in this together, and that you can be happy and healthy with simple things in life.
Well, I think that's a great way to end off this interview. I really appreciate you coming onto the 5 Foot Strong podcast, Minister Tibollo, and I hope we can help end the stigma of mental health together. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we end this episode?
No, thank you very much for having me. And I agree with you. Anytime you need me to speak or want to continue the conversation, I'm more than happy to. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Minister. I appreciate it. I want to finish off this episode by again thanking the Honourable Minister Michael Tibollo for sharing how he is trying to help end the stigma around mental health. Remember, taking care of your mental health is just as important as taking care of your physical health. If you are struggling with your mental health, reach out. There are people out there to support you and get you on the right path. You are not alone in this, I promise you. You are strong and you got to remember that. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Remember, whether you are 5 feet tall like myself or 5'11", we are all 5 foot strong. See you next week.
1, 2,